Israeli government breaking apart and heading to early elections this April. Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition was already on thin ice. The prime minister had just a one-seat majority in parliament after his defense minister quit last month. Today, leaders of that coalition announced an agreement to dissolve, they say, in the name of budgetary and national responsibility.
Well, it was just a month ago that Netanyahu urged the government to stay together for the sake of national security. The weeks since have seen a series of terror attacks in the West Bank, an Israeli operation against Hezbollah tunnels, and the U.S. withdrawal from Syria. After today's announcement, our Mike Wagenheim asked him if security is no longer an issue.
6 weeks ago, when the possibility of bringing down the government was before us, I said that we have urgent security matters to deal with. I couldn't reveal then what we did a couple of weeks later, which is to start this big operation to neutralize completely the terror tunnels of Hezbollah. It was right not to go to elections then, and I think it's perfectly sensible to go to elections now with a complete agreement, by the way, of all the partners, complete unanimity, and a great partnership for Israel. Thank you.
And diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim is in Israeli parliament in Jerusalem. Mike, we just heard the prime minister answering your question, saying basically the security threat has been neutralized. Everything's okay. We're ready to go to election. So tell us how we got to this point.
It's been a long, winding road, Nareed, getting to this point in time. The main problem with the coalition right now is finding a way past the ultra-Orthodox enlistment bill, this bill that would have drafted yeshiva students, ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students, into the IDF. It is an issue that has perplexed the government for years now. It looked like they had a solution a few years ago with Yair Lapid, the head of the Yesh Atid party, in the government. He passed a law that would mandate a certain level of yeshiva students to be enlisted into the IDF. They've gotten blanket deferments for the longest time now. That law was canceled when this current government took over. However, the Supreme Court has ruled time and again that the refusal by the government to draft yeshiva students into the IDF is a form of discrimination. They kept giving deadline after deadline for the coalition to come up with a more balanced law. The coalition never did. They had one last crack at it with another deadline coming up in just a few weeks. They expected, without the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties within the coalition, they expected Yair Lapid, who's now in the opposition, to support the bill. But Lapid said today, and he said for a few days now, that he smells a rat. He thinks there's a backdoor deal with the finance ministry in order to cancel out any kind of fines toward these yeshivas. If they don't send their students into the IDF, they're to be fined under a proposed law. He says that that money would be reimbursed to the yeshivas in a backdoor deal. He said he has evidence of it, but can't reveal where his source comes from. But he will not vote for it because he thinks the law now will be ineffective. The coalition didn't see a way past this, and with the deadline coming up issued by the Supreme Court, there's really no way forward, so hence, we're going to elections.
Mike, least we forget, Prime Minister Netanyahu facing possible corruption charges. Those are probably now likely to be decided on only after the election, but does he have his Likud party behind him in that eventuality?
Well, two things to answer to that. Number one, the indictments will not be issued before the election because there has to be a pre-indictment hearing, and a pre-indictment hearing will only take place if Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit really believes that there's enough evidence to move forward with potential indictments. That hearing will allow the Prime Minister to put forward his case for why indictments should not be issued. So while there won't be indictments per se, there could be a hearing which would give the public an idea that the Attorney General does think there's enough evidence. But to your other point about the Prime Minister, you know, we've spoken with a number of Likud members, the ruling Likud party, in which the Prime Minister is a member of. They all say, regardless of the allegations around the Prime Minister and the dent in the polls for the Likud party as of late, that Netanyahu is their guy going forward. We spoke with one earlier today.
It's very simple. Everyone in the Likud is behind the Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's going to lead the party for the next elections. He has proven himself for many, many years. He's the most experienced, the most knowledgeable. He is, the way we see it, he is in a much higher level than any other candidate for this position.
More on those corruption probes a little bit later, but another issue thrown into question here, Mike, is, of course, that Middle East peace plan, the deal of the century. Nobody's seen it yet. We don't know when it is coming out. Already we have word from the U.S. that it will affect the timing of the Trump administration's release of that plan. What about on the Jerusalem side of the equation?
This peace plan has been quite an enigma for quite some time. There's a joke around here about the deal of the century, that it'll be the deal of next century, because it just keeps getting pushed back further and further. And of course, looming elections aren't going to help. And the word now from Washington is that plan, again, will be shelved for quite some time. I spoke earlier with Regional Cooperation Minister Tzachi Hanegbi of the ruling Likud party. He's in charge of Israel's affairs within this particular region, within the Arab world. So he would know better than anyone where that project may stand. Let's give a listen as to what he had to say about this potential peace plan.
Well, I believe that the peace plan will be introduced only after the elections in Israel. I have no knowledge, but it seems logical. This is not the time for, the sensitive issues of the negotiation.
Mike, of course, a lot can happen in 3 months. That's an eternity in Israeli politics. But right now, Prime Minister Netanyahu still favored to be able to form a new government.
He is favored, but he's vulnerable right now for the first time in a long time. Even a couple of months ago, before the flare-up with Gaza, the 400 rockets launched by Hamas and Palestinian Jihad, his poll numbers were sky high. He looked invincible. But because now, after Gaza, the residents of the South were very upset at the Prime Minister's handling of that situation. We're now seeing Hamas-inspired terror attacks in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and now in the economic sector as well, with the number of price hikes and things like gas, electricity, and food, even though that appears to have been contained, but the Israeli public will still feel the effect of that somewhat. Netanyahu's poll numbers have slid a little bit lately. Now, make no mistake, he's still favored to be the prime minister, and there really is no candidate right now that the Israeli public sees as a potential replacement. The one wild card, though, I'm sure you'll talk about later, is former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz. He appears to be the only one that can make an indentation in the prime minister's numbers. Any other loss for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be a self-inflicted loss. It's not going to come from anybody on the left or the left center at this current time.